patch makes me dizzy. I don't know if I can do this. You know what? If Sarazawa could save the world with an eye patch on, I can get through a goddamn film review with an eye patch. Good evening, brothers and sisters of Kaiju. Pull up a seat, grab a drink. It's going to be a good review tonight. We're going to have fun tonight. So I have to kick things off appropriately here and thank everyone who's been watching and supporting. About last week, we crossed the 1,000 view threshold, and I'm very pleased and very proud, and I'm glad people are watching and enjoying. But as promised, since this is our 1,000th, try again. Since this is our 1,000th, I can't say that word. We're not saying that word. We're celebrating 1,000 views. Tonight, I will be reviewing the classic, the timeless, the genesis point of the whole genre we love and love to discuss. We will be going into 1954 Gojira. Oh my god, yes. So, and I should have given this dude credit like way back with the first review. This book, Godzilla on My Mind, and this is William Tsutsui. If you're a fan of the genre or Godzilla films in general, you are doing yourself a disservice every day you don't own this book. It's fantastic, and he has a whole chapter about the production of the very first film. So there are like 3 universal truths in my existence that I understand and truly believe in. One is that I will probably die of cancer, most likely caused by diet sodas. Bill Cosby is a rapist, and the original 1954 Gojira is the most criminally underrated piece of cinema, maybe in the history of cinema itself. This movie falls very much in with the tradition of films that almost shouldn't have happened. The odds against these films working are so like impossible, and they're up against such crazy odds, and yet somehow they not just happen, are like financially sound projects. They actually end up becoming like a cultural touchstone moment and launching and inspiring a lot of work behind them. I think of, Night of the Living Dead, Romero's film, the 60s film, the original Halloween movie, films that had to use unconventional methods, films that had to find ways to get around budgets. Although truthfully, the 1954 Gojira is maybe even more akin to something like Star Wars, in that there was actually a lot of money, there was a really talented team putting a lot of effort into it, and yet it just, a lot of people weren't confident in it. A lot of people didn't see it becoming the massive blockbuster that it was, and being the source of inspiration of changing the genre, changing how we talk about and see films the way it did. So to truly understand, we have to momentarily talk about where the Japanese cinema is at this point. Specifically, Toho, after World War II, is kind of struggling. They're having a harder time. Tomoyuki Tanaka is, at this point, a pretty new producer, but a well-respected one. And production times, I mean, it's the average Japanese film at this point, it's like pre-production, filming, post-production done in 50 days. I mean, you're talking a little over 2 months. At this point in 1954, Gojira, I believe, was his 4th film. He's already been knocking it out of the ballpark. He was supposed to have some other film, and it was like going to be filmed in a foreign territory, and something diplomatic hooty-hoo happened. He lost his project. And he had 6 months to fill a time slot for Toho, and it had to be something good. It was a competitive fall season. 1954 is a huge year for Japanese cinema. The Seven Samurai, there's a few other ones that, along with Gojira, that not just affect Japanese culture, but go on to become, I mean, really well respected films on the international stage. But so Tomiyuki Tanaka, he's in a crunch. He has to figure something out. 6 months, people, and there's a few conflicting stories about where he got the idea from. General consensus is the Lucky Dragon #5, the fishing boat that got exposed to a bomb test, one of America's bomb tests. The fishermen, there was like 26, I think, who were poisoned. And then some of the contaminated fish reached the market too. Big story in the media for Japan at the moment. But also, entertainment wise, we have The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. We also have a re release of King Kong that's even more financially successful than the original 30s one was. So Tomiyuki Tanaka is aware of all these things kind of mixing around, of what is selling in entertainment right now, what the public is talking about, and allegedly he's flying home from his failed negotiations to get the other film project. He looks out over the ocean and goes, "Oh, something's in the ocean, and it's a monster, and it has something to do with nuclear radiation." Blah, 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 blah. Which actually, that's not an uncommon motif. Even American films have been exploring this idea of monsters created by radiation. The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, I don't think it was a mutant, but it's like frozen, and the H-bomb or whatever melts it, thaws it. So in a lot of ways, Gojira is, by all means, taking a lot of cues from these previous films, from previous efforts. The difference is, though, with the Japanese culture, the resonance and the authority they can speak to on some of this. Also, and even critics who didn't like the film when it was released in the 50s did take time to note that this motif of the radioactive monster has been already schlocky and terrible, with terrible human elements, cheap production values, and if anything, it's kind of insulting that, we're building into the Cold War here. This science is very fascinating, very scary time in history for a lot of reasons, and the best Hollywood can do is offer us paper mache bullshit about it and not even really have a good discussion about it. And critics do notice and give this film a lot of props for elevating the conversation across the board. And it is, this is the blueprint for so much of what kaiju genre becomes. I'm not sure we would talk about a genre of kaiju films the way we do without this film. King Kong kind of beat us to giant monster on the rampage in the 30s, but so much of what Toho does with this project sets the standard. The suitmation, right? This is something we also lose sight of and don't appreciate, that up until now it's claymation. In fact, Toho initially was planning to do claymation with this, and they did not have the budget, they did not have the time to make claymation happen. They invent on the spot suitmation. They are just throwing, spitballing ideas, and this one sticks. And it took them a while. I mean, the stories of what this poor actor had to go through. He lost like 20 pounds in this suit. He couldn't film in it for more than like 4 minutes because he's suffocating and he's blind in it. It was a terrible, terrible suit for practical purposes for the actor, but it created an effect that, yes, even at that time, a lot of people criticized as being dated. There's an equal number of critics and film buffs who talk about it as a revolution in special effects. In fact, Steven Spielberg, there's an article, or an interview with him talking about going into Jurassic Park, and he cites the original 54 Godzilla. He probably saw King of the Monsters, but this idea of seeing something that's real in front of the camera, seeing the actual monster and actual buildings crumbling, he talks about that. That's a moment for him of realizing and going into Jurassic Park that he needed something in the camera, and he wanted to create that moment of, you really believe you're seeing a monster or an animal of some sort in front of you moving through the city. So the suitmation in general, I think it's important, and I think it succeeds way more often than it fails. The actual suit looks pretty damn good. Uh, One of the harder points is that they have like a upper body puppet prop that they use. It's funny. It's almost the same problem. They like stepped right into this again with the return of Godzilla in the '80s. That like the suit looks fantastic, and then these props we're using often don't. They look pretty jarringly different. Um, but what's weird, and maybe there's two puppets here. Maybe I'm missing this. Maybe there's two props going on. One prop tends to look a little derpy and goofy, and then there's this other one that actually certain angles of it, and maybe that's it. It's just the way the shot was set up. Look really good actually. Like make Godzilla look very scary, very ominous, and especially mutant. Like the painful, distorted mutant effect, like really pops on certain shots. And yet, because of the nature of it, so much of it, it's amazing how well it came out. Akira Ifukube, who his soundtrack here is huge. It's a huge moment. You can't overstate what he did, how much he elevated this film with his soundtrack, and yet almost all of it written, recorded like a week. He did not see a single shot of the movie. I'm not sure they even sat him down and went through the plot or gave him a picture of the monster. He not only came up with the special or the soundtrack, the special effect work to create the roar and Godzilla's stomping effects. Akira Ifukube on the fly, like, and it's crazy how well so much of it syncs up. So I suppose let's start delving into details of the actual movie, the actual plot itself. It's a very interesting story. It's a smart little story, and it's a smart script. Honestly, as very few Godzilla films are this well executed. And I was kind of talking about this earlier with the Gamera films. I can't even believe I brought that up again. But this genre struggles at times making a script that introduces elements, throws down rules of its universe, adheres to them, follows through with all it sets up. And Gojira is fascinating in that, we have our scientists, obviously, between Serizawa and Dr. Yamane, but then we also have the the love triangle of Serizawa, Emiko, and Ogata. And it almost, when you hear that, it should be like, oh god, melodramatic, terrible nonsense bullshit, and it's really not. The screenplay is smart enough in its subtlety, and the actors, yes, a little melodramatic at times. I'll hand you, this is 1954. It's a different style of acting than what we're used to, but it's not bad. And especially considering where B-level monster films of this schlock tend to end up, these actors all do an absolutely phenomenal job. A detail of this film that is hard to appreciate nowadays is actually how realistic so much of this film was. And I love it. It's a stroke of freaking genius. The way the film starts off very panicked, chaotic, with the ship sinking, with the media reports flying out, with the families of the fishermen who are missing. They're in the government offices freaking out, demanding answers. The government doesn't know what to tell people. No one has a good answer. It hits the ground running. Like, you are immediately engaged. There's immediately a beautiful amount of tension and excitement to the film. And one of the best things about this film is, I think a lot of it's because of how rushed and haphazard some of this was. It comes across almost like a documentary at times. It's almost so removed, especially it takes the film a while to really set up who your protagonists are, who you're focusing on, and it creates this weird effect of like really watching a disaster take place in real time and watching it affect not just one character, but the whole population panicking. Likewise, into Godzilla's attack, you see people being evacuated. You see people being injured during the attack. The scene in the hospital afterwards is brutal. I like. I don't know if since I found the original 1954 Gojira, not King of the Monsters, but the actual Gojira, almost every time I watch that scene, it gets a tear out of me. It's brutal and it's haunting, and man, what some of the audience members seeing that in Japan, I'm sure it was. It looks ugly to us, but most of them remember having to watch newsreel stock of that exact stuff after Hiroshima. Like that hits their culture in a way we don't have a good basis to relate to, honestly. Um, and that again, that's something that the other films that Godzilla's maybe piggybacking off of, they don't get into the real consequences of it the way this one does. It's not a cute film, and that's something that's very hard to explain to people who, they think of Godzilla, they think of Godzilla versus Megalon, right? It's hard trying to make people really sympathize with the fact that the first Godzilla film was hard science fiction, well into a horror film at times. It was dead freaking serious. And if you can open up your imagination to it and ignore all the years of CGI you've been inundated with and take it in for what it is, for its time period, it is a staggering work of art. It's intense, it's painful, it's gritty, it is everything these men, this talented production team wanted to create. And it makes perfect sense. I mean, they all lived through World War II, but Honda in particular, he was a soldier. I want to say he was a prisoner of war, I think in China. And then coming back to Japan, he actually got to go through Hiroshima. And there's a great quote of his about seeing the devastation and saying it left you with the effect that, the worst isn't yet to come, the worst has happened, the world is already ending around us. To see how much destruction in the blink of an eye can be caused, it's like it's done. And now Japan has had to sit back for I suppose only a decade at this point, and watch the Cold War escalate and just feel kind of helpless and miserable with that. It Gojira is a challenging film. It's clearly, and when historians talk about, the way we talk about like post 9/11 filmmaking in this country, and we're usually referencing like the rise of the superhero movie. Somebody who's talking about cinema and looking at the different impacts that World War II left, it would be sad to ignore this film. This film is so clearly a fascinating reflection and discussion with its audience about where this country is, where the culture is, how the healing process is going or maybe not going. Because a lot of these things, it was hard to talk about. The Japanese government didn't want to talk about, the Japanese media, the Japanese public didn't want to talk about. They lost the war, and at terrible, terrible costs. And so I think to have it brought up in dinosaur form, I think clever in that it let people maybe separate just enough to have the thought in the discussion, but I can understand why some people were a little upset and offended by it. I mean, even down to Godzilla, we're kind of used to it, that weird scaly thing he has, but they designed it off the keloid scars of people burnt by radiation. He is, we think of cute, goofy Godzilla from the 70s. That almost all those elements, the original design point was to make him look horribly scarred and really, I mean, the dorsal spines, all of it was supposed to be kind of a gross mutation. And unfortunately, as the franchise grows and becomes has to wear 100 other hats, we lose that effect. So our cast here, we have Akira Takurada, who plays Hideto Ogata. Momoko Kochi plays Emiko Yamane. There's Serizawa is played by Akihiko Hirata. Takashi Shimura is Dr. Yamane. I kind of started to parse into Serizawa just because he's such a fascinating, fun character. It's hard to talk about this film and not want to get into Serizawa. But our love triangle between Ogata and Emiko, Uh, like I said, this could be a really sloppy, forced thing, and for the most part, it's not. It's actually the actors are subtle about it, and so it doesn't ever feel forced or overwrought. If you've been watching, I like to talk about the Ishiro Honda mirror. We've got a monster who mirrors the human interaction, the human characters, right? And I think Serizawa and Gojira, that's the connection this time. In that they're both kind of tragic characters. They're both kind of victims of circumstances that they didn't really have control over. Godzilla's an animal. He's not malicious. He's not deliberately trying to kill or destroy things, but by the nature of his mutation, he can't help that he's destructive and that he leaves radiation everywhere he goes. He poisons everything he touches. I mean, that's very specific moment when they discover the Godzilla footprint, and the Geiger counter goes crazy, and Dr. Yamane immediately starts talking about the well water being poisoned and contaminated. People shouldn't be drinking the water anymore. I mean, maybe again a cheeky reference to the contaminated tuna from the Lucky Dragon, but Serizawa's in a similar situation that his research, he wanted to create something good. He wanted to break new barriers and do something good with his science, and instead he has stumbled across something that is terrifying, destructive, something that he doesn't want anything to do with. And I love the ending sequence between him and Godzilla when he's underwater. And this might be my interpretation. I don't know if this is directly what Honda wanted, but it always struck me that when he gets down with the oxygen destroyer and Ogata's still there, and Godzilla kind of like looks over his shoulder for a moment, and then kind of slowly starts, it almost looks like he's kind of walking towards them. And it always felt to me like Godzilla actually saying, good, I know you're here to kill me. I know you're here to end this. I'm suffering too. I'm in pain too, and I don't belong in this world. And Serizawa has the same thing, like, yep, by the nature of what I've done and what I've become, I can't be in this world and have it be safe anymore. And it's almost a peace. It's almost peaceful losing them and the way they both let go. So a point with Serizawa that shouldn't be ignored though is, hi eye patch. Oh, hi eye patch. It's alluded to that it's an injury from the war, and that's one of the things that actually Ogata feels very guilty about, that he's interrupting Emiko and Serizawa's marriage with his own designs, is that he's messing up the marriage of a veteran of war who is injured, right? It is important. It's a subtle little thing that when people talk about the politics of Godzilla, actually, and GMK gets really in your face with this, but actually that this discussion was even back to the 54 Godzilla, that Godzilla is a embodiment and a reminder of all that Japan sacrificed in World War II, and then how quickly Japan tried to kind of ignore and sweep up the mess that had been caused by World War II. That, the shame of losing the war, the pain, the violence that they had to endure losing the war. And a lot of people argue, I mean, it would be your conservative parties in Japan argue that, it's disrespectful. We've done a disservice to the soldiers who fought and sacrificed bravely. And so I think it's an interesting little point with Serizawa that he is, and the script never sits there and berates you and really shoves it in your face, but there's a guilt cloud around all the characters who deal with Serizawa, that he's already sacrificed so much for his country, and now we're all kind of subtly throwing him under the bus. I don't dislike Ogata, but he unfortunately it feels like he doesn't get to be the player in this plot as much as a lot of the other people do. I tend to forget about him more. When I think of this film, I really tend to think about Emiko and Serizawa. Emiko is a really fascinating character too. I've always argued that Ishiro Honda is actually pretty good about his female characters. When you look at his peers and especially in the genre of film that he's dealing with, what they tend to do with women. Yes, he'll still fall into some of the tropes. Yes, there's a cultural level of misogyny, sexism here that, he can't even see to rise above yet. But I find it interesting how frequently in his films, even when it seems like they're in a position of weakness, um, he almost always finds a way that they play a very critical part. They do have a power in and of themselves to alter the plot in a way that a lot of the male characters couldn't achieve. And Emiko is, I mean, the exemplary demonstration of this, right? She is being betrothed to Serizawa by her father. She's not even allowed to choose who she marries. Uh, but she gets to go on all the research stuff, so she's part of the science team. She's not just background. But she is also the one, by the end of the film, who is holding all the cards. She knows Serizawa's secret. She, knows with her father's connections how to get this thing out, how to do it, and she's the one who makes the choice. She sees the children suffering, she sees all the wounded people, and it breaks her, and she says, I can't sit here and be helpless anymore. Knowing what I know, it is not acceptable to keep it a secret anymore. And she chooses to betray Serizawa, who, even though, she doesn't want to marry him, but you can tell she has a deep love and respect for this man. And it pains her to see him in this position. The oxygen destroyer utterly terrifies her. It's actually a really smart little abeyance in the film that you don't see the oxygen destroyer when Serizawa shows it to her. I think I think in King of the Monsters you do. In the original Japanese version, he says, I want to show you something. You hear her scream, and then the scene they both sit there and say, we're not going to talk about it. And then later at the end of the film, they show you what he showed her. Really, again, just a smart little thing to do within the script that keeps you guessing, keeps your audience hooked, and then the payoff for it is great because the actual moment with the oxygen destroyer when it eviscerates all the fish is a great moment. It's a great effect. But I've always really liked Emiko, and she gets what she wants at the end of the film in the worst possible way ever. I really like that about this film, that everything's tied up. It's tied up in a very tidy fashion, and yet the consequences of tying this bow onto this plot are terrible. They're really terrible. As if the whole thing isn't tragic enough for Emiko, one thing that really caught me this time is she is very deliberately the one lowering Serizawa's air tube as he's sinking down into the water. Like, again, you can comment that, okay, she's kind of powerful for a female character in this genre, but she's also literally helping him right down to his death. Like, it's kind of a brilliant little shot you wouldn't maybe notice or appreciate otherwise. So I suppose we want to talk some about Honda here, what Honda's doing. And it's hard to tell, honestly, because as I brought up a few times, this film was rushed. This was all I knew. None of these people had made a film like this before. Eiji Tsuburaya had work as a special effects director before. Especially model work. He knew what he was doing with model work. Some of his work, even before this film, he would do. It was like ships. He was recreating like battles during World War II of the ships, and some of his model work was so good, people thought he actually just taken newsreel from the actual footage. He kind of knew what he was doing, which, man, does it show with the city destruction sequence. But I mentioned at the top this weird, almost documentary feel at times, like a little removed, and it's actually a very unnerving effect, in my opinion. I really love it, especially the way we handle Godzilla and his destruction sequences. There's something, and it helps the gritty black and white and kind of gritty footage quality of the footage. It almost like it's like a racer head all of a sudden. Like suddenly everything you're seeing, it's like you can't quite look at it and you can't quite make sense of it because the way the shadows and the light play around, it almost becomes, yeah, it's like this surrealist nightmare all of a sudden. The effect of Godzilla in the city looks so good, and it plays some weird little trick on your mind at times. And one of the other things I noticed a lot through this time watching it, a contrast between dark and light, which it sounds, I know, silly for, well, it's a black and white film. Yeah, I get it. But I've always talked about Honda, the color palettes he chooses and what that means. So if he doesn't have a color palette, what he gets to play around with are lighting effects very much in this film. Another element is music and sounds and then silence, the way those get contrasted. Very specifically, Godzilla's destruction sequences, there's times where you're hearing the buildings crumble, you're hearing cars and people screaming, and then there's these weird moments where like Godzilla knocks something over, drops like the train cart, and you hear nothing. You don't hear the impact, you don't hear the crumbling building. I'm guessing probably these were just problems with the sound quality and recording and getting stuff to line up. They didn't have the time or the budget, had to get it out. But the effect again was what I was talking about, where it almost is hurting your mind at times how realistic one aspect is and then how jarring something else is. And it doesn't, I guess you could argue it breaks the illusion, but to me it actually makes a lot of the sequences with Godzilla feel particularly nightmarish. It's like what is happening is impossible, and the very laws are just, of the way the world works, are just flying in and out so quickly that it feels like Honda, it feels like the world is ending right now. So what I was talking about with dark and light, music or noise versus no noise, I noticed it's in the scene with the diet building where the politicians, right before they launch into their arguments about, are we going to talk about Godzilla? Are we going to let the public know? And we have the projector going, so it's dark in the room. We open up the curtains. In a black and white film, it becomes very obvious, like it's a very harsh adjustment as you're watching as the viewer, like, whoa, the whole room is very, very different now. And then we get into kind of the ugly politics of this, which, again, if you're going to get too harsh on Honda for his portrayal of women, 1954, the main government, like parliamentary system going on in Japan, and this woman stands up in the middle of some dude's speech and says, like, very directly, you're an idiot. You have to tell the public right away. Yeah, the women in this movie are not just background noise. I love that sequence. The play with light I was talking about. Dr. Yamane is sitting in his room, and he's brooding over the fact that everyone wants to kill Godzilla and he doesn't know how to stop this. He's sitting in darkness. Emiko turns on the light. He dismisses her, tells her to turn the light back off. He wants to be in darkness. Later, he brings up a theory that admittedly does just kind of slip in out of the script, that Godzilla is attracted to lights, and so you should get rid of the lights. Maybe I'm reversing it. Maybe they think it'll scare him away. Suddenly, Dr. Yamane is talking to the military about lights and what the impact it's gonna have on Godzilla. Another thing is one of the first shots. It's the first ship that gets sunk. We just see all the people on the ship, and then we just blinding lights. I mean, the whole screen is just washed out for a brief moment. And I think the idea was probably to simulate like what it was like to see the bomb from afar when the bomb actually happened. That you're blinded momentarily and then you see it. I'm not sure I found like a consistent theory for what that bizarre play with light is that he's doing. I've wondered if it's like, we turn on the lights, now we have the healthy discussion, and in the darkness is when we're hiding from the realities of Godzilla, the realities of the politics of the culture at the time. I'm not sure. Fans, I always like your theories. You got an idea, throw it out there. What I was talking about too, the contrast of music. and sound, and how sometimes you see Godzilla just waiting and it's dead silent. Ifukube's score too is very subtle at moments. You get kind of when he's first coming out of the water, it's this heavy bass, like brr, 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 and then just silence. Like it wasn't even a song, and then it hits you again out of the blue, brr, 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 and it's almost the Jaws effect. It's just very subtle, and yet it's building the tension so much. It's just, oh, I love it. I love it. Um, I also noticed too this time that before, well, okay, back to Serizawa, he's making the decision if he's going to use the oxygen destroyer or not, and he's, positive he can't do it. He's anguishing over there. What can he possibly do about this? And then we have that song. Damn it, I had the title for it. Look it up. It's a haunting, sad scene. I mean, the music sticks with you. It's another one of those moments where, like, depending on my level of sobriety, I might tear up a little bit, or I might just be freaking bawling. But he hears the music, and that's his epiphany, and then he turns it off. And there's a few beats of silence before he makes his declaration. Again, some of this might have just been the constraints of the production. Some of it might have just been mood and atmosphere Honda needed. He wanted this to be a serious film. He wanted this to be kind of creepy and uncomfortable. That might be what the sound effects are doing. Just interesting. Like, stuff I hadn't, as many times as I've seen this, things that hadn't leapt at me the way they did this time. I guess I've kind of talked about Honda and Ifukube. Eiji Tsuburaya, insane. The urban destruction sequence he creates is classic. It looks so much more realistic and effective than anything Hollywood has put out yet, than really anyone has put out yet. It's an underappreciated moment where, for a brief moment, the very paradigm and bar for special effects, I would argue not just in Japanese culture, around the world, has just suddenly had to take a moment to catch up to what he pulled off with the city destruction sequence. The model work is insane. It's crazy good. But one of the other things is the suitmation, right? This new style of how to bring a monster to life. They've invented, and I'm always a proponent for, something real in front of the camera. There's something in the human brain that I think we latch on, and the story becomes more powerful, more real when you see something in front of the camera. Mind you, CGI can do some brilliant, amazing stuff nowadays, but I still think we lose something frequently in that transition. One of the things, though, I really had the thought with Godzilla's movements this time is that actually the fact that at times you can kind of tell it's a man in the suit isn't a bad thing for the purpose of what this film is talking about. At the end of the day, this film is discussing the fact that all these problems, that Gojira's mutation, that his presence, that him being awakened, is mankind's fault. The fact that at moments he moves like a human being a little bit, I think is actually a really smart little connection that the human brain makes. It's probably something when we're sitting there watching it, we're not fully thinking about, and nowadays we chalk it up to bad special effects. For the time, people had not seen a monster move that organically and that convincingly in a city destruction sequence. Ray Harryhausen and the stuff he created with claymation is brilliant. It's absolutely stunning, some of it, but I would argue it was never as convincing and organic as the man in the suit. And in this way, we almost creates like this serial killer effect with Godzilla. It's one of those weird things that I think your brain is firing two different pieces of information at once, that you're seeing something impossible, a giant dinosaur moving through a city, and you're also seeing something that you inherently know is true, which is that mankind is a destructive, terrible animal at times, and humans do terrible things to themselves and to the worlds we create. And that's why I always advocate for suitmation. I've been very impressed with a lot of CGI, or what Andy Serkis does with like what motion capture, freaking brilliant stuff. But I think there is an important element that we lose when we move to straight CGI, and it's something that all of these films, even the bad ones, have. That when we see the man in the suit, as much as we love, the escapism of seeing monsters destroy stuff, there's a more important connection we're having, that it's humans destroying stuff, and that it's almost like having that illusion be broken just slightly reminds us of the importance of what these films and what this series always wanted to talk about, which is that man at the end of the day is ultimately responsible. All right, Kaiju fans, hey, thank you for sticking it out. I told myself I'd give myself a little leeway because I love discussing this movie. I could go for days and days and days. We'll see how we do in editing. See if I can cut this down into something remotely intelligible. Anyway, thank you again for all the support and everyone viewing. Thanks for your comments. Like I said, please keep them coming. I want to see what you guys think about these films. I love hearing your ideas on stuff. The whole point of the channel, more than just hearing me talk forever, is I like to hear the discussion of this, of other people's ideas and theories. So 1,000 views, maybe when we hit 2,000, we'll do another celebratory video where I do the same thing I always do. Drink and talk about monsters. Till next time, I'm signing off from Denver, Colorado. We're the Mile High City, and we're getting higher all the time. Oh, God. It hurts. Like, oh, never again.